Philip II of Macedon promised to destroy Sparta if they didn't surrender. The Spartans' one-word reply was so cold and fearless, it's still echoing through history. We all think we know the Spartans, bare-chested warriors charging into battle without fear. But behind the legend lies the startling truth, a real society more brutal, bizarre, and complex than most people realise. The problem with ancient history is that sometimes myth is more powerful than the truth. Truly reliable sources on the origins of Sparta are difficult to find. According to the Spartans' own history, the Dorians migrated to the area about 60 years after the Trojan War, eventually leading to the rise of Sparta. As early as 1824, classical historians disputed the source of this theory. They believed it to be rooted in what much of history leans on: propaganda meant to promote the strength of Sparta and differentiate it from Athens, which had an Ionian heritage rather than Dorian. The discovery of a written script from the Mycenaean period, referred to as Linear B in the 1950s, finally undermined the theory of the Dorians once and for all. The Linear B script showed the supposed invasion of the Dorians to be non-existent, with most Bronze Age movement moving away from the southern Peloponnese, not towards it. The fall of Mycenaean culture was a natural combination of many factors that typically happened over time. However, in its wreckage, it bore this unforgettable Grecian city, Sparta. The archaeological evidence suggests that Sparta came into being around 1000 BC, roughly 200 years or more after the collapse of the ancient Mycenaean civilization. Sparta began as 4 villages came together, rebuilding themselves from the fall of the previous culture. This created a period of chaos filled with a lack of law and strife. As such, the Spartans needed control if they were to survive. Luckily for them, the solution, supposedly, came in the form of one man. According to legend, Sparta would not exist if it weren't for the intervention of Lycurgus. The Spartans credited their later success to Lycurgus and the reforms he made in those early years. Some historians argue he was actually a Spartan god and not a person at all. Either way, the changes attributed to him changed the city forever. One of Sparta's earliest difficulties was a dual kingship. Most historians believe that this came from the amalgamation of 2 major villages that often struggled with unity. One of Lycurgus's main achievements was the creation of the Spartan constitution, which most stories agree happened after this dual monarchy ended. If one believes the myths and stories, Lycurgus introduced a radical new order: communal mess halls where men and boys dined together, a sweeping redistribution of land among citizens, and strict cultural values rooted in austerity and self-restraint. He created the very identity of Sparta, which may be why some historians question his identity, because how can one man do so much? While many records dictate what Lycurgus did, there are few records that state who he was. The records are also often contradictory. Lycurgus is a shadowy figure that seems to exist only to better the myth and story of Sparta. Some classicists also note that the root of Lycurgus's name derives from wolf, which is associated with the god Apollo. Some theorise that Lycurgus may have been merely an alter ego for the god. One of the reasons that Sparta continues to capture modern imagination is because they're credited as a great warrior culture. Their early history does suggest they spent years expanding their boundaries and further securing their own safety by defeating those around them. In other words, it was dangerous to catch the eye of Sparta. Sparta's location within the valley made it difficult to approach. This meant that Spartans didn't spend much time fortifying themselves against potential dangers. Amyclae was one of the few surviving cities near them and believed to be Sparta's most powerful neighbour, but even they fell likely around 750 BC, with their people either driven out or absorbed into the growing Spartan city-state. Sparta had one last battle to win in order to secure themselves as a source of power and strength within the Peloponnese and Greece as a whole. According to an ancient source, Tertius, the battle to conquer the Messenians, Sparta's western neighbours, lasted 19 years. But as always, doubt is cast upon these accounts. Much of Greek history as told by poets like Tertius was told for entertainment as much as it was for sharing information. As such, historians turned to archaeology and other sources for a fuller understanding of the truth. While the length of the battle remains questioned and modern sources believe that it happened later than Tertius's account suggests, there's enough evidence to confirm that Sparta conquered the Messenians through a second conflict around the 7th century BC. As a result, the Messenians were reduced to the status of helots, giving them a semi-slave status within early Spartan culture. Now Sparta had its eye on its remaining neighbours. To the east, Sparta was bordered by a territory known as Canuria. There's more doubt about whether Sparta battled over Canuria. However, their low population suggests that Sparta continued to hold power over them as well. Regardless, by the end of the Second Messenian War, Sparta became a recognisable force of power, and the rest of Greece respected its strength. No one could rival the Spartans. Now that Sparta had exerted its power over their neighbours, it was time to centralise that control. Previously, as exhibited with the success over the Messenians, when the Spartans conquered a city, they absorbed their people into their own society at a degraded position akin to enslavement. But a significant loss in the 6th century BC saw a change in Sparta's treatment of invaded states. During this period, potentially still under a dual kingship, Sparta made an attack on their next biggest opposition, the city of Tegea. Tegea did not fall as easily as others before them had. After Sparta faced a significant defeat referred to as the Battle of the Fetters by ancient poets, they found themselves forced to change their strategy. Instead of attempting to conquer all their neighbours, Sparta began to seek alliances with them. Eventually, this alliance grew to become the Peloponnesian League, which banded together many of Sparta's neighbours through loyalty, with Sparta retaining their position of leader within the league. When other portions of Greece faced pressure from outside forces, they turned to Sparta to rescue them. However, there was one force that could match Sparta's might: Athens. Sparta seemed to first engage with Athens in 510 BC, when they travelled north to help in overthrowing Hippias, an Athenian tyrant. In this period, the term tyrant was far more neutral. At the time, a tyrant was merely a ruler who came to power without constitutional right. It had no reflection on their temperament or ability to rule. As such, Sparta removed Hippias, not out of justice, but for their gains. But then they tried to take things just a bit too far. Sparta moved into Athens to dispose of Hippias with the backing of an Athenian aristocrat named Isagoras. They successfully removed Hippias, and the Spartan king Cleomenes took power, but the Athenians weren't too fond of the change. They exiled Cleomenes, forcing him to return to Sparta. However, from that point on, Athens remained a desirable target, and tensions between the two powers grew, creating a tiny flicker that eventually grew into an all-consuming flame. Some 50 years later, in 499 BC, the entirety of Greece entered into conflict with invading Persians who were looking to conquer Greek land. This started the Persian Wars, which lasted for 50 years. As the two largest city-states at the time, smaller states often called upon both Athens and Sparta to defend their land. One of the most famous battles during the Persian conflict is the Battle of Marathon, between the invading Persians and the Athenians. However, as the battle raged, the Athenians sought help from the only ally that could match their might: the Spartans. The Athenians sent a runner from Athens to Sparta. Understanding the importance of his mission, the man supposedly ran the entire 140 miles between the two cities in order to seek help. When the runner Phidippides arrived in Sparta, he didn't receive the reception that he or Athens were hoping for. The day he arrived, the Spartans were celebrating a sacred festival, Carneia. This period called for peace. Rather than jumping to the Athenians' aid, the Spartans informed Phidippides that they couldn't gather the armies or march to the conflict until the full moon rose. This would take at least 10 days. In the meantime, this left Athens to hold on to Marathon on their own. The Spartans were good to their word. Once their festival period concluded, they marched to Marathon, covering the ground in 3 days. However, by that point, the Athenians had already succeeded in winning the battle. 10 years later, the Battle of Thermopylae fell during the Olympic truce. The Spartans felt they should honour this truce. The other states disagreed and began assembling forces. Sparta was the greatest power on land, so they faced pressure to contribute. Without their input, they felt Athens may defect to the side of Persia. In the end, they made an unexpected move, one that ended in tragedy but cemented their place in cinematic history. Eventually, the Spartan king Leonidas led a mixed group of about 7,000 men to defend Greece at the Battle of Thermopylae. The men fought valiantly for 7 days, holding back the Persians until a traitor in their midst gave their enemy an upper hand. When Leonidas found out, he sent the troops from other cities away, holding his place on the field with 300 Spartans to face the grand Persian army. Leonidas and the Spartans refused to back down. In a moment that remains as one of history's greatest last stands, the Spartans fought to the very end, despite the fact that they likely knew they were far outmatched by the imposing Persian army. And though history remembers their valour, their enemies couldn't let the defeat go without one final, embarrassing addition of insult to injury. Xerxes, the Persian king, ordered a harrowing display for Leonidas's lifeless body. Reportedly, he ordered the body decapitated, mounting the head on a stake and sending the remainder of it to be crucified. In 464 BC, Sparta faced an unavoidable disaster. An earthquake destroyed much of the city. Sources from that time say that as many as 20,000 died. While modern historians feel that number is probably exaggerated, this earthquake significantly weakened Sparta. But even worse than the fatalities, it caused a serious crack in the relationship between Sparta and Athens. The earthquake resulted in a revolt from Sparta's slave class, the Helots. Athens sent aid to Sparta, but Sparta sent the reinforcement back, fearing they'd take the side of the rioters. The snub offended Athens. They cancelled their treaty with Sparta, sending Athenian politics into sweeping reform. The culture in Athens became increasingly anti-Spartan. Officially, the Peloponnesian Wars pitted the Delian League, which Athens controlled, against Sparta's Peloponnesian League. Sparta was not able to participate in the First Peloponnesian War with the force they were known for. The earthquake and resulting revolt still took up much of their manpower. They ultimately entered a 5-year truce with Athens. However, this wasn't a sign of giving up. They were preparing for a bigger fight. While their truce with Athens was only for 5 years, they signed a 30-year peace with Argos. This ensured that when the time came to attack Athens again, nothing would divide Sparta's attention. They'd be able to focus their full might on Athens and Athens alone. 6 years later, Sparta and Athens sparred again. This Second Peloponnesian War became the longest and most impactful conflict in Greek history. For the bulk of the conflict, Sparta went on the attack while Athens secured themselves behind their large city walls. Sparta was the Greeks' power on land, however Athens had the sea. Therefore, Athens used their navy to attack the Spartan coastline. The early Spartan navy was inefficient, so they turned to an old enemy. Persia provided Sparta with much needed funds to support their navy in exchange for ancestral lands. This gave the Spartans the extra might they needed. Sparta now had Athens cut off by land and sea. Athens had no choice but to surrender to the might of Sparta. After much debate, Sparta allowed Athens to keep their lands. However, their defensive walls were torn down and they had to withdraw from the Delian League. Athens had fallen. Sparta no longer had a true adversary that could rival their might. For a while, anyway. Sparta briefly retained the partnership with Persia that had originated during their conflict with Athens. However, Persia eventually attempted to push against Sparta's might, forcing the two states into conflict. Persia attempted to use the states already opposed to Sparta against them. This led to a series of battles that ultimately concluded with Sparta reinforcing their strength, and many states fell under Spartan control. No one city-state could face the might of Sparta. However, Thebes, Athens, Corinth and Argos thought they might have success if they banded together. This started another civil conflict known as the Corinthian War. This time Persia, now fearing Spartan invasion, supported the other side, leading to the Peace of Antalcidas. The treaty gave Persia the Greek cities of Ionia and attempted to curb Sparta's influence on all of Greece. Despite this peace, Sparta continued to battle with Thebes, seizing their citadel of Cadmea. The conflict between Thebes and Sparta continued until 371 BC, when Spartans faced something they hadn't in a very long time: defeat. The Thebans defeated Sparta at Leuctra, and the Spartan forces took heavy damage. Thebes emerged as the Greek source of power. Sparta faced a problem internally as well. A citizen of Sparta inherited that standing through blood. However, the Spartan population declined and the population of Helots rose. The population began decreasing by 50% every 50 years, war or no war. The very fibre of Sparta began to dissolve. Sparta managed to hold on to a small amount of power for another 100 years or so. When Messenia revolted, the Spartans failed to hold on to it. From that point on, Sparta began to lose its power. Eventually, they were overpowered by Alexander the Great. Still, even in their decline, the Spartans never forgot who they were. During this final conquest, Alexander's father, King Philip II of Macedon, sent a warning to Sparta: "If I invade Laconia, I shall turn you out." The Spartans' reply was just one word: if. Even so, Alexander ultimately forced them to join his League of Corinth, a union of Greek states created to consolidate all of Greece's military forces. Despite never regaining its former glory, Sparta never forgot its fierce sense of independence. They were Sparta, and always would be. Since the success of Alexander the Great, Sparta had been a part of Macedonia. However, a new power began to rise within the region: Rome. Although it officially became part of the Roman Empire, the Romans designated Sparta as a free city. The Roman elites were amused by Spartan customs. They attracted Roman visitors who wanted to come see for themselves. The once mighty Sparta became a tourist destination. Contemporaries disagree on how much freedom Sparta truly had in this period. However, everything changed in 396 AD when Ulric, king of the Visigoths, sacked the city. Although it was rebuilt, it was much smaller. Ultimately, it was abandoned during this time as an Avro-Slav group continued to raid the city. Sparta had fallen. Today, Sparta is little more than a memory. Although King Otto of Greece expanded the small middle-aged town of Sparta back into a city and people continue to live there today, it's no longer the place of glory it once was. However, Sparta's control of ancient Greece and their determination to live on in the face of defeat continues through legend. Thanks for watching History Exposé. If you love uncovering the best stories in history, hit like and subscribe to keep exploring with us. Don't forget to visit our main page, Factinate, for more incredible facts about everything.